Hi, everyone. I am Tanya Tarr. I'm a behavioral scientist and I'm a Thinky Brain.
And I'm Katja Cahoon, psychotherapist, and I'm a Feely Brain. Welcome.
Welcome. This is Thinky Brain, Feely Brain, where we answer readers' questions and we present Thinky Brain and Feely Brain solutions. Okay, so I got a really good question from a reader, and I'm leaning very heavily on your wisdom, Katja, with your Feely Brain, because I don't like this question. The question we got from a reader is, are trigger warnings really necessary for people? Right. And so let's first define a trigger warning, right? So I think of trigger warnings as when people put and I've seen on Twitter in particular, they put CW colon, and then they write food, suicide, violence, whatever. But it's mostly used, I think, on social media and sometimes in meetings, right? Or when you're interacting with other people. I just want to learn at your feet, Katja, because I don't know about this question. What do you think?
Well, I think it happens in classrooms as well, right? Or
Oh, yeah.
schools, colleges, and so on. I've heard that people give or want trigger warnings. Well, so when you first ran this question by me, I thought a little bit about my own schooling. So I thought I'll just share a couple of things and then talk about how I view this and what I think about, is it necessary or not, right? So when I grew up, I remember it's like second grade or so, the teacher had put up a life-size picture of a starving Ethiopian child because there was some kind of famine going on, and made us all walk by it and look at it. Right. And that image is still seared in my mind. And there was no trigger warning at the time, right? And we're talking quite a few decades back that I was in grade school. And then we talked, I grew up in Germany, as you know, about the Holocaust and World War II a lot in graphic detail. When Schindler's List came out, the whole school was bussed to watch that movie, right? And so
Wow.
there were no trigger warnings. And some of this, I would say, really has created some vicarious trauma. And all of these things are important, right? It's important to be exposed to these things and learn about history, especially your own history and so on. And certainly we have in every country, well, lots of countries, and we have Native American genocide, slavery,
Absolutely.
the gulags in Russia, and what happened in China, Germany, the Holocaust, and so on. So what comes to mind for me is that trigger warnings are okay. However, if we just have trigger warnings and then don't look at these difficult things, that's a problem, because we do live in a society where we need to collectively learn to confront difficult things, difficult emotions, difficult situations, difficult history, difficult current events, right? We certainly have enough going on. So I think of it as trigger warnings plus, and the plus is teaching people what I call distress tolerance. So the ability to be with difficult things that are different from your opinion, or that are challenging, that bring up strong emotions or pain or whatever it might be. What do you think?
That's great. I'm fascinated by the concept of distress tolerance, because I think using the word resilience can get a little touchy these days. And I will say too, particularly as someone who's a member of the media and, listening to some of my friends who are particularly, Indigenous and Black, and part of the queer community, posting pictures of violence where someone is violently being killed or injured, those kind of things are traumatizing. So I think trigger warnings around that, I think, are really important. I think there are people too that have certain life experiences that so maybe they've survived a suicide attempt. Me myself, I am a survivor of violence. A little bit of a tangent. I saw on Instagram someone referred to people like me as cycle breakers. So I hope more people use this concept of cycle breakers, because that actually is a different way of presenting an experience, right? I am a survivor of violence, but I also am a cycle breaker of violence. A little bit of a tangent, but I bring that up because there definitely have been times where people would post news articles or information or their experiences where they're talking about in very graphic detail their experience with domestic violence or things like that. And I do appreciate those trigger warnings. I also think sometimes there's an overextension of this. So when people use the lack of a trigger warning as an excuse to start a fight, as opposed to opening up a discussion. I find that to be harmful to the community. I know where it's coming from, and I hope that we all get better at having communication around that, right? So both that we're able to very gently is not the right word, Katja, but we figure out a way to sort of we figure out a
How
way to
about
support.
compassionately? The word that's
Yeah.
coming to mind, compassionately,
Yep.
having
these discussions, or even just supporting one another in muddling through difficult stuff. Because I really love your points about how we have to, there's like two things going on here. We have to do a better job of preparing people to look at things that are difficult to look at, but we also have to develop distress tolerance around examining things that are difficult. And I think this is not so much trigger warning, but I have noticed that there is the potential, especially on Twitter, which is text-based, right? So this is a very different dynamic when you're just communicating via text, because there's very little emotional nuance, that I do see people having conversations that get very rapidly competitive as opposed to collaborative. And so, I think that's what spurs kind of this conflict, because, there are bad actors in that medium. But figuring out ways to sort of talk about difficult things, doing our best when we can to label trigger warnings, but then also finding ways to muddle through and have conversations like, hey, you posted this thing. It was really upsetting to me. That probably wasn't your intent, but let me explain to you why that's upsetting. Right. And then the original poster being able to say, I'm really glad that you brought that up. I'm going to try and do better in the future. Right. And that is, I'm going to label that, Katja, Thinky Brain tactic, only because it's communication tactics. But it is deeply emotional. And I really appreciate you sharing your experience too, because in a different way, but in a very similar way, in the United States, we are trying, sometimes not very well, to confront a very long history of slavery and of stolen land from Indigenous peoples here. So it's tough. It's really tough, because people do get very emotional in a variety of ways without finding ways to sort of muddle through it and have those difficult conversations. What other tactics do you have for distress tolerance? I'm fascinated. I love this phrase. I've read this phrase, distress tolerance, before. Tell me more.
Yeah, well, I mean, it really is about staying in a window of tolerance of something that we can tolerate, right? Whether it's somebody posting something on Twitter that hurts us, or some other original content, or just being confronted, right? I mean, there's a lot of work being done right now in terms of slavery and looking at some of these things and racism and so on. And it can be really uncomfortable, especially for people who've never confronted that, right? I see that in some of my trainings. So I come at this from partially from a mindfulness perspective, and that's why I brought up the compassion, right? So compassion really means feeling what the other person is feeling and feeling compelled to take action. So there's an action component to compassion that I think is really important.
Yeah.
Right? So, and compassion also includes the sense of self-compassion. So when confronted with difficult material and something comes up, to realize, oh, this is difficult. This is painful, and kind of what you're describing based on your history, and thank you for sharing that, and that sometimes something is painful or triggers something, and then to develop the sense of self-compassion. There are even specific techniques, whether you do a metta or loving kindness meditation, for example, is something that's even been researched to have an impact, where we send good messages of goodwill toward ourselves, and also toward others, including difficult others. So that might be that person on Twitter, that might be a politician we don't like, whatever. I mean, people do all sorts of things. The other thing, go ahead. No, you go ahead. Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, from a nervous system perspective, right? There is a nervous system response to difficult material, whether it's the person on Facebook trolling or whether it's, seeing violence, right? So learning to soothe our nervous system is really important in that. And how do we do that? Our first line of defense is social engagement. So connecting with another person. Now, that's incredibly downregulating with a sympathetic other person.
Right. So maybe you leave Twitter, for example, like don't
Yes,
connect
I
with
think
them on
that,
Twitter, but like call them or text them outside of the app. Yeah.
or talk to someone else first, right? Run it by someone. I have my best friend Naomi, and when something's going on, I call her and I said, okay, I need to rant, and she'll listen, and well, I'll get it out, and then I feel calmer because she's just holding space.
Yeah. Yeah. And also we talked about holding space the other episode, like
Mm.
holding space for me means just listening without giving advice. Like that's the most short answer, I think, for holding space, right? Like just, or if they ask for it, doing sort of active listening where you repeat back things that you've heard from them to help them feel a sense of being seen and literally heard.
I love that. And on occasion, it could also include a little bit of validation. And as I always say, validation doesn't mean agreeing. It just means you validate how that person is feeling.
Absolutely.
And that actually is very down-regulating. It's very soothing.
I think maybe too, this is why trigger warnings can be helpful for some people, because it lets everyone know, like, we're sharing this, but we want to validate those that have suffered from this previously. I think I did think of,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I did think of something on the like Thinky Brain, Feely Brain side of things. I very strongly identify as a Thinky Brain because empathy, and we'll talk about this in another episode, but empathy is actually really hard for me. It's very difficult for me to feel empathy for other people. It's not because I lack the ability to feel empathy. It's that I am so sensitive that when I feel other people's pain, it can literally like physically, mentally, emotionally, like take me out. And I manage some chronic health stuff, so I have to be very careful. Some people use the concept of spoons. I don't typically use the concept of spoons, but the idea is that we have a limited amount of time, limited amount of energy, right, to get through our day. And so I think the other aspect of there's another thing you can do that looks a lot like empathy that will also help you if you're a super thinky brain. Be I think better at trigger warnings, at thinking about them, using them, and things like that, is perspective taking, right? Like to take the perspective of another person. You don't have to feel everything that they are feeling. Also, as a thinky brain, I find, and maybe some other in the empathy episode, we'll talk more about this. I have some pretty strong feelings about empathy because it can be kind of manipulative if used the wrong way. But perspective taking is very similar, except that you don't have to feel everything, but you can have an objective perspective of that person's experience. You can educate yourself on that person's experience, and then use that information to be very inclusive in how you move forward. So if you're a thinky brain person, and by the way, even talking about trigger warnings makes me tired, because not because I don't want to engage in it, right? But because I'm thinking of all of my friends who, as a part of their daily work, had to re-traumatize themselves, particularly during the summer of 2020, Black journalists in particular, who had to watch things happen. It's re-traumatizing for them. And so I feel tired even talking about it, because I think of all my friends who are suffering, and it makes me angry because I'm a woman of action. I want to take action, but I can't do that. So perspective taking for me is a little bit safer. And just understanding, like, this is where they're coming from. Right. And so as you're writing things, creating content, giving lectures, to use trigger warning as ways to think of it sort of on the thinky brain side of this. Am I solving this equation to make sure that people who might have experienced these terrible things feel validated before we go into the difficult thing? Which, oh my gosh, Katja, I just realized it goes back again to self-affirmation theory, right? Yeah. You're helping people feel seen. And that actually, according to the science and many different studies, that you make people feel seen and validated, and they're better able to navigate difficult conversations. Speaking of trigger warning, actually, I was teaching a class and I had a student who had some pretty severe anxiety, and he told me that his therapist told him to not hold a breath during diaphragmatic breathing, because that was a trigger for him and his trauma. I was really glad that he told me that. And so now, because like you, I love opening meetings with group breathing exercises. I don't do the hold anymore at the top.
Yeah.
But then I also say before we start, you know, you're on your own reconnaissance, so we're doing this together. But if you have known issues around this type of activity, it's totally fine for you to sit it out.
Absolutely. I do that too, right? I mean, we know each other, but yeah. And different breathing techniques work for different people, right? Some people can take very long breaths and some people have to take very short ones. But I wanted to say one thing before we maybe do like a little wrap up about empathy. So I don't actually really work with empathy. I work with compassion. And I'm not sure
What's the difference?
Yeah, so compassion. Empathy is basically feeling what the other person is feeling. And that's taxing, right? If you think about it. Compassion, and I don't know if I got the definition completely right earlier, compassion is recognizing the suffering and feeling compelled to take some action. And that includes recognizing the suffering in ourselves. Okay, we've talked a little bit about our own reactions to different things. So there is an action component. And I've been testing this out a little bit because I'm studying a lot of Buddhist influenced meditation and mindfulness techniques. So I feel really saddened by homelessness. And there's a lot, and especially right now, I'm in the Midwest, it's cold, it's really sad. And it's very easy to look away, right? It's one of those things that's really easy to look away. So one of the small things I've started to do is that action component. I made some care packages that are in the car that have some socks, underwear, some gloves, some, you know, some personal care items, some fem care items for women, female homeless population. Really, that's a big need. And to give that to people. And the other thing, my husband and I were about to have some brunch somewhere, you know, we can do that, right? It's not a problem for us. There was a guy outside, it was, you know, 30 degrees or something, on a bike, nowhere to go. So he asked us for some money. We gave him some money, but we also bought him a hot coffee and a meal. Not a big thing for us, but it made a big difference for him. And so engaging with that person, looking at that person, talking a little bit with them, that wasn't draining. Actually, I think my husband and I kind of in a way benefited maybe as much or more from this than he did, because we had all sorts of pleasant emotions from that action, from that interaction. So that for me is compassion. It's not just feeling, but it's recognizing it and taking some small action.
Yeah, I love that combination. And I think too, we'll talk about it some other time.
Yeah, we have to have a segment on it.
on empathy, compassion, and perspective taking. Yeah. And
I love the perspective taking.
Yeah, it's the key thing there is sort of just, can you see things through the perspective of someone else in all three of those cases, right? And so yeah, I had never before this conversation, to be honest, I never thought of trigger warnings as a way to help other people feel seen. And so that's going to help me do a better job.
That's cool. I didn't either. So I feel we uncovered something new that kind of recognizes the importance of that. While also I feel one of the big things, the takeaway from us is helping people deal with difficult material situations, people, reactions.
Yeah, just developing mindful distress tolerance. Yeah. I like it.
I like it.
Thank you, Feely Brain.
Thank you, Thinky Brain.